Hello, everyone. My name is Chris with National Parents Organization, and today I have two gentlemen here. We're gonna have a really interesting conversation. I have Jay Marchetta, and I hope I'm saying that right. He's an economist, a doctor, a professor at Stanford University, and Martin Kulldorff, who's a statistician, epidemiologist, and professor at Harvard University on leave, and he serves also on the advisory council for the National Parents Organization. So, Jay and Martin, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
And so you guys, the reason you're here today is you've written a an article here, and it was published in the Federalist, and I'm going to bring that up here for the audience here to see. And that article is how illogical child support rules can force kids into poverty. And so I think it's a really interesting article, and let's get into it. So first of all, I want to talk about the title's pretty out there. So how can child support force kids into poverty?
The key thing, Chris, is that the child support amounts are calculated based on a formula. Different states have different formulas which are revised routinely. What happens often with those formulas, the goal is, of course, to try to make sure that children who are in shared parenting have resources available to them, whether they're spending time with their mom or with their dad. But what happens with those formulas, it results in either excessive or too little child support amounts, such that there's a big imbalance. And maybe they spend time with their dad and they're like essentially starving because the dad can't afford basic things for them, and then when they spend their time with their mom, they're plenty of resources, or vice versa. It's not that it always gets it wrong. It's that it sometimes gets it wrong, and in those cases, it creates this imbalance where kids essentially are put in situations where they don't have resources they should have when they're spending time with a parent that ends up with less than they ought to get.
Yeah, and certainly that has the opposite effect of what the courts are intending, right?
Yeah, the courts in principle should be trying to make it so that kids have resources available no matter who they spend it with, otherwise spend time with. Otherwise, there are like consequences for this. Like you have incentive effects, right? So you can get situations where if a parent spends a little bit more time with the kid, with their kids, the child support amounts don't change very much, and so that they end up they have a disincentive to want to spend more time with their kids. They essentially penalize for spending more time with the kids. So there's a lot of knock-on consequences for getting this formula wrong.
Yeah, and it's the mathematical formulas that are wrong here. And I guess family court lawyers may not be experts in mathematics always, and certainly that shows. So it can actually be that, let's say, a father who spends about 20-25% have their child for about 20-25% pay more child support than a father who has never seen the child, who has abandoned the child in certain states. Other states, for example, in many states, we have the example from Mississippi, but other states are the same. If you have a father who has two children with different mothers, it could be that the mother who makes more money gets more child support, and the mother who makes less money gets less child support. So in that situation, the wealthier mother should get less, and the poorer mother should get more, because there's no reason that the father should give more money to the child who has a mother that's much more wealthier. One absurd example is from Connecticut, where suppose the father makes $42,000 a year and the mother makes $30,000 a year. What do you think that the child support would be in that case? Well, it's $12,103. So it just reverses. So that's if they have 50-50 custody. So they have the child the same amount. Before child support, the father makes $42,000 and the mother $30,000, but then there's over $12,000 in child support. So after child support, the father makes less than $30,000 and the mother has more than $42,000. So these are absurd examples where the mathematical formulas are simply wrong. And you starve the child in one family to feed them in the other, or in the case of Mississippi, you starve the child with the poorer mother to feed the child who has the wealthier mother.
Yeah, it certainly is not a fair system at all. And I think I've seen other examples where, particularly if there's a big differential between the mother and the father's earnings, that the formulas sort of get worse, right, as you get away from the norm, from the middle. So, are there any states out there right now you think that are kind of doing it right? And I know states have very complicated guidelines and all that, but is there a beacon of hope out there that other states should be looking to?
We haven't found a single state who has good guidelines. Every state we have looked at has some of these flaws, and they are linked to two things. One is how those guidelines deal with shared parenting when the child spends considerable amount of time with both parents. And the other set of flaws are when they are half siblings, where you take money from a parent who then don't have money to spend on the half siblings. So those are the two areas where there are major flaws mathematically in the formulas. But we haven't found a single state which is able to deal with this. And the states have often very similar guidelines. They sort of copy each other, and they copy the same errors that they have in the mathematical formulas.
That's incredible. And from my knowledge of this, I understand from an economic standpoint, there's several different ways that the states can use as a baseline for sort of figuring up how much each family would need, right? There's different economic models, that you can use as a basis. And do you guys have a recommendation, or is what the states are using, is it a good economic model that most of the states are using?
So what you're talking about is the basic child support obligation. When you calculate child support, the first thing that the guidelines does is determine, okay, if the parents make this amount of money and there are 2 children or 3 children, what is the obligation? So what is the cost of having the children? So that's the first step. The second step is to say, how much should each parent contribute to that amount? Let's say it's 10,000. So you say, okay, the father should contribute 6,000 and the mother 4,000. And then the last step is how much do each of them get, depending on what the parenting schedule is. But different states have somewhat different ways to calculate the amount of basic child support obligation. But that's not the major problem. The major problem is in how the guidelines, because it can be a little bit more, a little bit less, and that's going to increase or decrease the child support a little bit. But the thing that creates the absurdities are not in that child support obligation. It's in the way that the formulas account for various amounts of shared parenting and how they account for half siblings.
So let me just emphasize that point. Different states can decide, how much children ought to have available to them, this basic child support amount. I guess different states can have have a lot of leeway over that. But just taking that as given in any state, there's a mathematical formula that decides how much each parent should contribute. It's that mathematical formula, taking as given the how much the child should get, that's wrong. That creates all these negative economic incentives to spend time with their kids.
But the companies and the states who, when they do this, they spend often a lot of time with adjusting this child support obligation a little bit up, a little bit down, even though it doesn't make much difference. But then they completely forget these other two steps, which they get terribly wrong.
And I think what I've heard these called sometimes are cliff effects, right? Where if it's less than 50%, it's one amount. If it hits 50.0%, it's another amount, right? And that causes people to fight.
That's one problem, and for example, Idaho has had that problem. So you change the amount of parenting time by a few hours, or maybe one day a week or something, and then suddenly the child support changed a lot, and then they're not really fighting about how much time to spend with kids, because they should spend 50-50 equally. That's the best for the kids. But then they fight about on which side of this cliff effect they're going to be. So that's created a lot of it's a problem is not logical, and it creates animosity in the court system. So that's one of the flaws of these guidelines, those cliff effects. But it's only one of several mathematical flaws.
Yeah, and I want to go back just to the basic obligation for just a minute, because it's something that's been pointed out to me, and it makes a lot of sense. As you know, a loaf of bread costs the same amount to virtually everybody, right? And it has no, bearing on how much income somebody gets. So, if a poor family versus a rich family has to buy a loaf of bread, it's the same amount. It doesn't necessarily go up. And I know on a lot of these child support numbers, they sort of will take that number and ratio it up based on the income amount. So I think that creates sort of artificial costs that aren't really there, right?
So I think almost all states have it so that if the parents have more income, then the amount of money assigned to the child is more. And I think bread costs the same, but there are other things where children of wealthier parents tend to have more expenses, in the sense that maybe they have their own room in the house, so they have a bigger house. Maybe they have more extracurricular activities and so on. So I don't think it's unreasonable that the child support obligations are higher for parents that are wealthier. I think that's quite reasonable. There's actually a situation in Wisconsin where it's opposite, where for certain income ranges, the obligation goes up if the parents are poor, and I think that doesn't make sense. But that's, I think, only one state I know of have that problem.
So what are states to do? I mean, what's the recommendation? How do states fix this sort of problem, and how do states create a situation where parents aren't fighting over over these cliff effects and some of the other issues with the current system?
I mean, the thing is like, I think if you know that there's this mathematical formula problem, what the right solution is just to replace the mathematical formula with the correct one. I mean, I think it's fine, just as Martin said, to have different kids at wealthier parents. The expectation is more that you give to your kids. That's fine. It's fine for states to decide different levels for that expected levels of child support. The problem is the mathematical formula for dividing who pays, and it's just a simple mathematical fix. You replace this mathematical formula with these cliff effects and all the range of pathologies that Martin identified and you identified, with a different formula, and a lot of these, or most of these problems, just go away. And it won't result in the total amount that the kids get changing. What it'll change is the likelihood that kids will face deprivation when they're spending time with one of their parents rather than the other, or change the incentives for parents to spend time with their kids at all. That could change. Really, it just solves these incentive problems with it, and it's I don't even think it should be political. It should be non-controversial. I think everybody wants the parents to spend, but the kids to spend equal time with their parents if it's at all possible. Everybody wants the kids to have equal support, financial support, no matter which parent they're spending the time with. And this formula just makes it not possible sometimes. I think this should be, it's one of these things where, like, people just didn't notice the formula was causing these problems. And once you pointed out, I would think there should be widespread support for fixing it. Martin and I wrote a paper. Actually, it was Martin's main idea, but I helped to propose a different formula, a formula that doesn't have these problems. This is one of these things where it's in public domain. We don't want to sell it. We just want this fixed so that kids in these very difficult circumstances can have a better life.
Yeah, so the fix is easy because we just use a correct mathematical formula, and we give such a formula in our paper that was published by the National Bureau of Economic Research. So that is easy, and that can be combined. Those formulas can be combined with different levels of child support, higher or lower. But the problems are really catastrophic here for many parents and children, because many parents are obliged to pay child support that they simply cannot pay, and they cannot feed their children with that. So and then they disappear from the children's lives. In many cases, parents will go to jail because they are the flawed mathematical formulas tells them to pay child support they cannot pay, and then when they don't pay, they go to jail. So in the Federalist article, we mentioned this story from Missouri where a girl she's working extra to help her mother pay child support for her, so that the mother don't have to go to jail.
Pretty incredible.
So children shouldn't have to support their parents so that they don't go to jail just because there's a mathematical formula that messed up the child support calculations. Another example was from Oklahoma. A father, he's the main. The father is taking the 2-year-old daughter lives with the father, but then the father was sent to jail for not paying child support. Again, the mathematical formulas are wrong, and then parents are sent to jail instead of taking care of their kids.
Yeah, and certainly, going to jail doesn't help anybody out, because then you can't make income to pay the support that you're obligated, and then the state has to pay for you to incarcerate you, and it's sort of a spiral, right? Certainly doesn't help anybody out. So out there's your paper, and we'll link to it in our notes so people can go read that. What's been the reaction so far from the states? I understand, Jay, I think you mentioned you talked to Governor DeSantis about this.
I did. So I've been one of his Governor DeSantis's. Actually, Martin and I've been one of Governor DeSantis's advisors on COVID policy, and so I had an opportunity to spend just last week a couple of minutes, some time with him, I spent just a couple of minutes talking about this topic because we were mainly talking about COVID policy. But he seemed very interested. I explained to him some of the incentive effects, and he looked shocked. I think the idea that there's just a mathematical formula that's wrong, that's creating all this havoc, is not well known. I didn't see a lot of people pick up our National Bureau of Economics research piece that we published, documenting this problem and outlining the formula. This is why we wrote that Federalist op-ed, is to raise awareness, because I sincerely don't think this should be a controversial topic. This should be just a simple, once you understand this is a problem, just fix it. It's just a math problem. It's in nobody's interest that kids work to so that they can pay the child support amounts for themselves, and so their parents don't go to jail. That makes no sense. Nobody wants that. It's not a matter of like values of like, how much should we give to the kids. That's set by the basic child support amounts. We're not arguing around that. It's just a question of how do we set the amounts so that they don't create these horrible incentive effects and have this uneven distribution of income when the kid spends time with the mom versus with the dad in complex family situations.
I mean, a lot of people are aware that the child support guidelines doesn't work because they live it either as children or as parents. But I think very few people have realized that the main reason for it is because of mathematical flaws in the formulas that create absurd amounts. Not in all cases, because it works in some cases. But even if it works in 80% of cases and it creates disaster in 20% cases, or even if it's 90 in 10, that's a problem, because even 10% of everybody having involved with child support, parents and children, if it doesn't work for the 10%, that is a huge problem, because that's millions of people, millions of children who suffer because of that. So it works sometimes, but it shouldn't work always. And if we have proper mathematical formulas, we can do it so that it always works. You don't get these absurd results.
Yeah, certainly the consequences for that small percentage that it affects is really large, right? Let me ask this: in the correct formula, or the suggested correct formula, is there a limiter function, or is there a cap where you say, okay, well, both parents have enough, or, this parent, shouldn't pay child support because it's, silly to be moving money around when both parents have money already? Or, is there any sort of limit on the top or bottom end that you're suggesting as part of the formula?
There are situations where nobody would pay child support. For example, if they have 50-50 equal share parenting and equal incomes. When it comes to like upper limits and lower limits, that's a decision that states will have to do at what if there's an upper limit that you don't pay ever more than this. So the formula can be combined with that, but that's for each state to do in terms of what logic they want. The formula can be combined with having the more wealthy parent contribute more, or to contribute proportionally. So it can be combined with various subjective views that the states have. But the key thing with the formulas, the framework we do, is that it's logical, so you don't get these absurdities. You remove those, and then you can combine it with different subjective views about should it be more, should it be less, should the richer parent pay more or less, and so on. And
people can have different opinions about that, of course. That's not the crucial thing. The crucial thing is the division. And the formula is just wrong. It just creates havoc some fraction of the time. It should be 0% of the time it creates havoc. And with the correct mathematical formula, you can solve that havoc.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Let me ask this: should there, with that, 10 or 20% of the population being affected by the formula being wrong, should there be some federal protections for families in the event that these formulas are wrong until the states can correct them?
I mean, I'm open to lots of different ways to actually solve it. Like, you could have model legislation that the states adopt by themselves. That happens in many areas of state law. Where that formula is just used. It doesn't necessarily have to come from the federal government. I mean, the federal government could provide guidance to states, as they do with many matters on this. I think what states currently do is they revise these formulas every few years, and they hire consultants. And the consultants, I'm not sure exactly what they're responding to, but so they may be, whatever happened in the state the past few years, they're like trying to like address. But the result is a hodgepodge of formulas that create different problems in different states. None of it's necessary. You just replace it with the correct formula. So I mean, like for instance, if the parents' organizations put out model legislation, I bet you most states would just adopt it because it just makes sense to do so.
So the states can throw out the current flawed formulas and implement logical formulas. So any state has the ability to do that. At the same time, it's the federal government who are actually mandating states to do child support guidelines and to update them every few years. And that's sort of a condition for the state receiving aid from the federal government to manage the child support system. So the federal government could just say, well, you should have guidelines, but they should follow certain basic logical principles that, for example, you don't pay more child support if you spend more time with the child. Or if you have two children, then you're not going to give more child support to the one with the wealthier ex-spouse than with the poor ex-spouse. If the parenting time is equal, and there are no other half siblings. So the federal government could make this requirement to require the states to have logical guidelines that don't give these absurd results that send people into jail. And then the states will be free to have it more or less and do the subjective things as they want, as they do now. But the federal state could require the states to have logical guidelines without mathematical flaws in the formulas.
Yeah, excellent point. I want to take a minute to ask you both your opinion on the case where we've heard of, where the state will reclaim money from someone paying child support to pay back a welfare obligation. So should the states be allowed to collect child support and keep it and put it back into the state budget with that money not going directly to children?
So what happens is that the state will give welfare to one parent and then get child support from the other one, and when that's gotten, it just goes into the state coffers. And I think there's a lot of problem with that because often both parents are very poor. So basically, the state is giving welfare to one parent at the same time that they are taking money from another poor parent, and the child needs both parents. So if you take money from a very poor parent, you're actually harming that child. So the system is, that particular aspect of the system is not functioning. It's harming children very, very, very much. Harming poor children, especially, very much.
I mean, Chris, as you know, there's so many problems with the system, especially when you're talking about very difficult family circumstances. I mean, I think there's so much that needs to get changed within it. It often makes things worse. It pits parents against each other, creates incentives to fight in court, and when it should be trying to seek peace. The problem is these are so many problems. I think that like for us, it's kind of a one issue at a time thing. Like this one, what we've identified, I don't think it doesn't impinge on basic values, except to say we don't want to ruin people's lives unnecessarily, kids' lives unnecessarily. So that's why I think we've talked about this issue, written about this issue, because we believe that anyone of good faith looking at this will want this change. And I think it hasn't happened just because people haven't brought attention to it. My hope is that once people learn about this, that they will want this change. It's such a simple fix.
So we've got any other things that you guys want to talk about before we wrap this up? We're kind of running out of time.
No, thank you very much for having us. It's and for emphasizing this topic, and hopefully we can get the states to change the guidelines so that they are logically consistent without mathematical flaws in the formulas.
Thank you, Chris. Really grateful to you.
Well, Jay and Martin, thank you so much for coming on. And just remind us again one more time, if you're an advocate for reforming child support, and what can people do? Can they download your paper and then get that to legislators? What do you guys recommend?
Yeah, the paper is in the Federalist, so they can Google Federalist and child support, and they will find the paper. It's based on a more academic paper published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, and you can search on our names and that organization. I also think that the National Parents Organization is doing great work on child support, as well as on shared parenting and other custody issues. So it's great to join the organization, and it has chapters in most states. So that's a good way to join with and collaborate with others to change flawed system.
Well, Jay and Martin, thank you so much again for coming, and we look forward to hearing more from you. And we'll get this published out on YouTube, and hopefully we can talk again sometime.
Thank you.
That'd be great. Thank you so much, Chris.